Everyone thinks British tourism is about the same 5 places: London, Big Ben, Buckingham Palace, the Stonehenge selfie, maybe a rainy walk across Abbey Road. Most Brits are genuinely fine with that, because it keeps the good stuff quiet. But here's the weird part. The United Kingdom has a village of fewer than 1,300 people sitting next to one of the 7 natural wonders of the world. It has a Cotswolds settlement of 3,300 residents that hosts close to 300,000 tourists every single year, which works out to roughly 90 visitors for every local. It has a pastel Italian village built from scratch on the Welsh coast by one obsessed architect over 50 years, and a golf town where Prince William met Kate Middleton while wearing a red academic cape that cost more than most students' rent. Most British travellers have never set foot in half of these places. That's not an exaggeration. It's the reality of a country where everyone fixates on the same handful of destinations, while tiny villages, market towns, and surreal little cities rack up visitor numbers that would embarrass a mid-sized European capital. Today, we're counting down 10 small UK destinations that secretly pull in millions of tourists every year. We're starting remote, finishing world famous, and somewhere in the middle there's a village with 0 permanent residents that still gets more visitors than most university towns. If you like discovering places that somehow aren't on your usual travel feed, stick around and hit that subscribe button. Not because YouTube demands it, but because the algorithm runs on attention and mild guilt. And frankly, these places deserve better PR than the tourism boards have given them. Let's start on the Northern Irish coast, with a village where the world's oldest legal whiskey has been distilled for 400 years, and the ocean builds its own staircase for fun. Number 10. Bushmills, County Antrim, Northern Ireland. Population 1,247. That's not a typo. The village is smaller than most high school graduating classes, and yet this tiny Ulster settlement holds one of the most stubborn claims in the drinks industry. The old Bushmills distillery calls itself the oldest licensed whiskey distillery on earth, based on a royal charter signed by King James I in 1608. That means they started making whiskey here 13 years before the Mayflower even left port. Around 120,000 people show up every year to taste it, walk the copper stills, and pretend they understand single malt aging better than they actually do. Here's what makes Bushmills genuinely strange. 3 kilometres up the road sits the Giant's Causeway, a UNESCO World Heritage Site where roughly 40,000 interlocking basalt columns step down into the Atlantic like someone built a staircase for gods. Around 1 million people visit every year, which quietly turns this village of 1,200 into the base camp for Northern Ireland's #1 tourist attraction. The Irish legend says a giant named Finn MacCool built the columns to fight a Scottish giant across the sea, realised his opponent was massive, and disguised himself as a baby to escape. The geological explanation involves 50 million years of volcanic activity, but the giant story lands better in the pub. Picture walking into the Bushmills Inn after a blustery day on the cliffs, gas lamps flickering, turf fires smoking, dark oak panelling, and live traditional Irish music spilling out into the night. You're drinking whiskey from a distillery that predates the United States by about 170 years, while somewhere outside an Atlantic gale is rearranging the North Antrim coast again. 5 kilometres west sits Dunluce Castle, the medieval cliff ruin that Game of Thrones fans will recognise as House Greyjoy's ancestral home. Led Zeppelin put Dunluce on the inside cover of Houses of the Holy back in 1973. 16 kilometres inland, the Dark Hedges tunnel of intertwined beech trees plays the King's Road in the same show. 1,247 people, one natural wonder, one Game of Thrones location, and a whiskey older than most countries. Not bad. But the next place on this list has something Bushmills doesn't. It has 77 tourists per resident during peak season, and half the population still speaks a language most of Britain can't pronounce. Number 9. Portree, Isle of Skye, Scotland. Romantic Scottish fishing port. And let them run wild. Pastel houses in pink, yellow, blue and buttery cream line the harbour in a tight horseshoe curve, tucked below jagged cliffs and emerald hills. Thomas Telford, the engineer who built most of the Highlands infrastructure in the early 1800s, designed the iconic pier. Condé Nast Traveller put Portree on its list of the 20 prettiest villages in the UK and Ireland. The name comes from Port Rig, Gaelic for the King's Port, named after King James V's 1540 visit when he sailed in with warships to force the Skye clans to recognise royal authority. Flora MacDonald said her final goodbye to Bonnie Prince Charlie at the Royal Hotel here in 1746, and that moment became the Skye boat song. People don't really come for the town though. They come for what the town leads to. 10 kilometres north sits the Old Man of Storr, a 55-metre basalt pillar that is the most photographed rock in Scotland, pulling in roughly 250,000 visitors per year. The Cuireann's massive landslip, the Fairy Pool's turquoise waterfalls, Kiltrock's vertical pleated cliffs, and the Quillin Mountains' black gabbro spires all sit within an hour's drive. If the landscapes look familiar, that's because Skyfall, Prometheus, the BFG, Macbeth, Stardust, Transformers, and roughly half of Outlander were filmed here. A 2024 facial recognition study of social media photos ranked Skye as Scotland's happiest tourist experience, which is either the most modern compliment possible or slightly dystopian, depending on your mood. Here's the catch nobody tells you. Skye is running out of road. Local councils have quietly asked visitors to plan differently because parking lots overflow, single-track roads clog, and a village like Portree can only absorb so many rental cars before the whole thing grinds to a halt. Paradise has a maximum capacity, and Skye is bumping against it. But our next stop on this list actually invented an entire global sport, and nobody outside of golf culture really understands how much of the town is just quietly running the game worldwide. Number 8. St Andrews, Fife, Scotland. 17,700 residents swell to nearly 30,000 when the university is in session, which means 37% of the town is aged 16 to 29. One of the highest student-to-local ratios in Britain gives the place a strange mix of medieval gravitas and very fresh graduate anxiety. Here's the thing nobody outside Scotland fully grasps. St Andrews isn't just where people play golf, it's where humans invented golf. The Royal and Ancient Golf Club, founded in 1754, still governs the sport worldwide everywhere except the United States and Mexico. The old course has hosted the Open Championship 30 times, most recently in 2022, and in 1457, King James II banned the game entirely because his soldiers were too busy hitting little balls around to practice their archery. Jack Nicklaus said it best when he put it this way: "If a golfer is to be remembered, he must win at St Andrews." The town leans into that heritage hard. The whole place smells faintly of sea air and cut grass from April through October, and the Himalayas Putting Green claims the title of the world's oldest mini-golf course. What most tourists miss is that St Andrews was Scotland's medieval religious capital long before it became golf's headquarters. Cathedral ruins dominate a cliff edge overlooking the North Sea, and when it was built in 1318, the interior stretched 357 feet. That made it the largest church ever built in Scotland, a title it held until John Knox preached one particularly incendiary sermon in 1559, and a mob tore the place apart within a single week. St Rule's Tower still stands at 33 metres, offering the kind of view that makes visitors briefly question why they don't live here. St Andrews Castle crumbles gently into the sea nearby. The university was founded in 1413, making it the third oldest in the English-speaking world after Oxford and Cambridge. One more detail worth mentioning. Prince William and Kate Middleton met here in 2001 as first-year art history students, which eventually led to a billion-person televised wedding and a future king. St Andrews basically ran the most expensive matchmaking service in modern British history, and didn't even charge a finder's fee. West Sands Beach, the 2-mile stretch of golden sand just north of town, was used as the opening sequence of Chariots of Fire in 1980. The famous shot of athletes running in slow motion through breaking waves was actually a reshoot, because the original negatives got scratched by the sand. Even the iconic cinema moments on this list required a second take. Coming up next, a village that has 0 permanent residents was entirely designed by one eccentric architect over 50 years, and accidentally became one of the most recognisable cult TV locations in British history. Number 7. Portmeirion, Gwynedd, Wales. Permanent residents, 0. Annual visitors, around 220,000. This is the first entry on the list where nobody actually lives in the place, which should tell you something about how unusual it is. Portmeirion is a village in the same way that a movie set is a village. An eccentric Welsh architect named Clough Williams-Ellis bought the entire peninsula in 1925 for £5,000 and spent the next 50 years building his own private Italianate fantasy on the Welsh coast. He finished the final structure at 93 years old. The end result looks like someone picked up a slice of the Italian Riviera and casually dropped it into Snowdonia, which is roughly how every visitor describes their first reaction. Pastel pink, sunshine yellow, turquoise and buttercream facades climb the hillside in clusters of domes, campanile bell towers, triumphal arches and Gothic pavilions. About 50 buildings in total, many of them salvaged pieces from demolished stately homes across Britain. Clough called the village a home for fallen buildings, which is both poetic and technically accurate. Noel Coward sat down here in 1941 and wrote Blithe Spirit in exactly 5 days. George Bernard Shaw, H.G. Wells, Ingrid Bergman and Gregory Peck all stayed at various points. Frank Lloyd Wright made his only trip to Wales specifically to visit. George Harrison celebrated his 50th birthday here in 1993 and recorded parts of the Beatles anthology interviews on the grounds. But the reason most people know Portmeirion has nothing to do with architecture and everything to do with a cult television show. The Prisoner, Patrick McGoohan's surreal 1960s spy thriller, was filmed here across 17 episodes between 1966 and 1968, and Clough kept the location secret until the final episode's credits rolled. To this day, the Prisoner Appreciation Society holds annual gatherings featuring human chess games on the village lawn, because that is obviously what you do when you visit a place that starred as the dystopian prison called The Village. Clough's daughter Susan founded Portmeirion pottery in 1960, whose botanic garden pattern became one of Britain's best-selling ceramic designs of all time. When Clough died in 1978, part of his ashes were later launched into the sky inside a firework rocket during a New Year's Eve celebration over the Dwyryd estuary. That is genuinely the most Portmeirion way anyone has ever exited this planet, and honestly, it tracks. National Geographic Traveller called it the UK's most distinct village, a slice of the Italian Riviera on the Welsh coast. The year 2026 marks the village's 100th anniversary, so if you've been meaning to visit, this is the year the entire place will be quietly celebrating itself with even more enthusiasm than usual. Up next, a walled medieval town where the smallest house in Great Britain sits beside one of the finest surviving castles in Europe, and both are squeezed inside a city wall you can walk all the way around without ever leaving. Number 6. Conwy, North Wales. Just under 15,000 people live inside a walled medieval town that Edward I built in 1283, specifically to keep the Welsh in line. The castle went up in just 4 years, which for the 13th century is an absolutely unhinged construction pace. Master James of St. George oversaw 1,500 workers, and the finished product is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, described as one of the finest examples of late 13th century military architecture in Europe. What makes Conwy different from every other castle town in Britain is that the walls are still entirely intact. 1,300 metres of medieval stonework, 21 towers, and 3 original gateways form a continuous ring you can walk in full. You can circle the entire town along the top of the wall without ever touching ground, which feels like a video game cheat code, right up until your legs remind you it's also 3-dimensional. Inside the walls, the town hides Plasmore from 1585, considered one of Britain's finest Elizabethan townhouses. Aberconwy House from around 1420 is the oldest documented house in Wales, and because Conwy never does anything small, the smallest house in Great Britain also sits on the quayside, a red-painted fisherman's cottage measuring 6 feet wide and 10 feet tall, officially Guinness certified. The last occupant was a 6'3" fisherman named Robert Jones, who managed to live here until 1900 despite being physically too tall to stand up inside his own home. There are days when that feels like a metaphor for the entire British housing market. Thomas Telford built the suspension bridge across the estuary in 1826, deliberately designing the towers to match the castle. Robert Stephenson added the railway bridge in 1848 right alongside it. Two engineering legends, back to back, politely fighting for architectural harmony with a medieval fortress. Only in Britain. The mussel beds in the estuary have produced pearls since Roman times, and a Conwy pearl is reputedly set into the British crown jewels. At one point in the early 19th century, 4 kilograms of pearls per week were shipping from here to London jewellers. The coastline was quietly outfitting royalty, while most of the locals were just trying to stay dry. Here's the detail nobody mentions. When Conwy Castle was first finished, it wasn't grey. The entire thing was painted bright white with lime wash, which against the Welsh sky must have looked completely ridiculous in the best possible way. And the garrison stationed inside this supposedly impregnable fortress originally consisted of exactly 30 men. 30, guarding one of the most strategically important castles in medieval Europe. British understatement clearly has deep roots. Coming up at number 5, a Lake District market town that accidentally invented the modern pencil, quietly produced escape tools for World War II pilots, and has been overwhelmed by tourists for over 200 years. Number 5. Keswick, Cumbria, England. 4,658 residents. The Lake District around them pulls in more than 40 million visitors per year, making it the busiest national park in the United Kingdom. Keswick sits on the northern shore of Derwent-water, with the bulk of Skiddaw rising directly behind the town at 931 metres, and this little market town qualifies as one of the most visited gateway settlements in the entire park. The market charter dates to 1276, when Edward I granted the right to hold regular trading days. 750 years later, the Thursday and Saturday markets still run. That's continuity most countries can't even imagine. Here's the unexpected twist. Keswick is the birthplace of the modern pencil. In the 16th century, local farmers in nearby Borrowdale discovered a seam of incredibly pure graphite after a storm uprooted a tree and exposed the deposit. Shepherds started using the graphite to mark their sheep, and then someone realised you could wrap the stuff in wood. The Cumberland Pencil Company was founded in Keswick in 1832, and during the Second World War, the company secretly produced special escape pencils for Emra 9. They hollowed out the wood to hide tiny compasses and silk maps of Germany, handed them to captured RAF pilots, and hoped for the best. The factory kept making pencils until 2008. The Derwent Pencil Museum houses the world's longest coloured pencil, a Guinness-certified 26-foot monster weighing over 450 pounds, which is the kind of record that only makes sense once you accept that the British will commemorate absolutely anything with a plaque if you give them long enough. Samuel Taylor Coleridge moved into Greta Hall here in 1800. Robert Southey, the poet laureate, lived in the town for 40 years. William Wordsworth wrote most of his Lake District poetry next door in Grasmere. Beatrix Potter holidayed nearby, which is why Squirrel Nutkin's adventures involve sailing across Derwent-water. Canon Hardwick Rawnsley, vicar of the local Crosthwaite Church from 1883 to 1917, was one of the 3 co-founders of the National Trust in 1895, meaning the entire British heritage conservation movement essentially started within a few miles of this tiny town. John Ruskin summed up the problem best when he called it, quote, "a place too beautiful to live in." Samuel Taylor Coleridge, writing home in 1800, complained that the town emptied out in winter, but then became packed with tourists of every shape and size the rest of the year. That letter is 226 years old. The problem has not improved. Picture standing on Friars Crag at dusk, boots crunching on wet gravel, mist threading between the peaks of Catbells and Blencathra across the water, peat smoke drifting from pub chimneys in the village below, 100 metres of still black lake between you and the Derwent Islands, and somewhere behind you, the market square is setting up for tomorrow morning. The same view that convinced Wordsworth to dedicate his life to writing about weather. That silence is what people keep coming back for. Next up, a Cornish fishing town where 83% of residents voted to block second homeowners. The water sometimes looks like Greece, and the artists who set up studios here in the 1940s accidentally created one of the most important art movements in British history. Number 4. St Ives, Cornwall, England. Population just under 11,000. Annual visitors around 760,000. The town comes second in the entire UK for tourist spending per resident, bringing in roughly £85 million a year and supporting 2,800 local jobs. That's a lot of fish and chips. What draws everyone in is light, specifically the St. Ives light, a soft, shifting, mirror-bright Atlantic glow that bounces off white sand and turquoise water in a way that painters have been trying to capture for over a century. Barbara Hepworth once said, "The light here is like nowhere else in England." James Fox, the BBC art critic, described St. Ives during its creative peak as more famous than Paris, more exciting than New York, and more progressive than London. Those are not small claims for a Cornish fishing village. Alfred Wallace, Ben Nicholson and Christopher Wood planted the flag of the St. Ives School here in 1928. When war broke out in 1939, Barbara Hepworth, Ben Nicholson and the Russian sculptor Naum Garbo evacuated from London and joined them. Patrick Heron, Roger Hilton and Peter Lanyon followed. Tate opened a dedicated branch gallery right on Portmeirion Beach in 1993, its wave-shaped facade slotted into the hillside as if it grew there. The Barbara Hepworth Museum preserves her home and sculpture garden exactly as she left them when she died in a house fire in 1975. The town sits on a peninsula with 4 main beaches within a 5-minute walk of each other, which is almost unfair. Portmeirion catches the Atlantic surf. Porthminster faces south with water that rivals southern Spain for clarity on a good summer day. The harbour beach curves into the town itself, and tiny Porthgwydden sits tucked behind St. Ives Head like a secret. Legend says an Irish saint named Ea sailed across the sea here on a leaf in the 5th century, which is roughly how things tend to go in Cornwall. The Sloop Inn on the harbour dates to 1312, making it one of the oldest pubs in England. The town was a sardine fishing port for centuries before the Great Western Railway arrived in 1877 and quietly turned it into a national holiday destination inside of a decade. Now here's the catch. Nobody puts on the brochure. In 2016, 83% of local residents voted to ban second homeowners from buying newly built properties, making this one of the first British towns to legally fight back against over-tourism. Average house prices here top £320,000, which is roughly 14 times the median Cornish salary. In 2020, St. Ives was named the most expensive seaside holiday town in the entire United Kingdom. The town where artists came to escape the real world has become one of the most expensive places in the country to actually live in, which is its own kind of tragic poetry probably. Coming up at number 3, a Gloucestershire village so overrun with tourists that more than 9 out of 10 residents say out loud there are too many visitors, and locals call it the Venice of the Cotswolds, although nobody in Venice has ever agreed to that comparison. Number 3. Bourton-on-the-Water, Gloucestershire, England. Population 3,296. Annual visitors around 300,000. That works out to roughly 90 tourists per local, which means every resident is statistically responsible for hosting nearly 100 visitors a year. Not metaphorically. Actually. People call Bourton the Venice of the Cotswolds, which is slightly generous, but not entirely wrong. The River Windrush runs straight through the centre of the village, rarely more than 25 centimetres deep, crossed by 5 low stone bridges dating from 1654 onward. The oldest bridge is called Mill Bridge, and if you stand on it in August, the water is shallow enough that children wade through barefoot, while ducks navigate the shallows around them. 114 of the village's buildings are listed as Grade 2 or Grade 2 star, which in British planning terms means you cannot even change the paint colour without filling out 6 forms and apologising to the council. That legal fortress of conservation is why the village has looked essentially identical since the Edwardian era. The model village built in 1937 is 1/9 scale, genuinely made from real Cotswold stone quarried 3 miles away, and took 8 craftsmen a full 5 years to finish. Inside the model village, there's a model of the model village. Inside that smaller model, there's a smaller model still. It's geographic inception, all in miniature, all in honey-coloured limestone, all shockingly detailed. Britain's only listed model village, a Grade 2 monument of a village about a village. Nearby Birdland Park houses the only king penguin colony in the United Kingdom, which is not something anyone would have predicted would end up here. The Cotswold Motoring Museum stars Brum, the small yellow car from the 1990s children's TV show, because of course it does. The strangest local tradition is football played inside the river on August bank holiday, a custom over a century old. Goals get planted directly in the windrush. Players slosh around in knee-deep water trying to kick a muddy ball past a goalkeeper who is visibly regretting his life choices. In December, a Christmas tree is planted in the middle of the river, lights reflecting off the surface while ducks paddle past the base like the whole thing is perfectly normal. One recent survey found that more than 9 out of 10 residents openly say the village has too many visitors, and a motion to officially designate over-tourism as a problem failed by the narrowest possible margin in 2024. Great British Life magazine described the situation as a village loved to death, which is a surprisingly beautiful way to describe being drowned in discarded fudge wrappers. Up next at number 2, the second most visited tourist destination in the entire United Kingdom, which is also a perfectly normal Warwickshire market town that happened to produce one specific glovemaker's son 400 years ago. Number 2. Stratford-upon-Avon, Warwickshire, England. Population 30,495. The Shakespeare Birthplace Trust reports that Stratford is the second most visited tourist destination in the entire United Kingdom after London, pulling in between 2.5 and 3 million people a year. Per capita, every Stratford resident personally hosts nearly 100 tourists annually, same as Bourton. Except here, most of the visitors are clutching paperback copies of Hamlet and looking mildly confused. The market charter dates to 1196, granted by King Richard I, which means Stratford has been legally trading for over 830 years. For most of that time, it was a perfectly ordinary Warwickshire market town. And then a glovemaker's son named William was born here on the 23rd of April, 1564. He wrote 37 plays, died on the exact same calendar date in 1616 at age 52, and accidentally created an entire tourism industry that's still feeding the town 400 years later. Shakespeare's birthplace on Henley Street is a Tudor house with black-painted timber beams, floors that creak with every step, and ceilings so low that tall visitors permanently develop a stoop. Here's the fun fact nobody wants to hear. Those black beams weren't actually black in Shakespeare's time. The Victorians painted them black in the 19th century because they thought it looked more authentically medieval, and everyone just went along with it for the past 150 years. The real Tudor aesthetic was natural, untreated wood, which is less dramatic and harder to photograph, but historically accurate. The Royal Shakespeare Theatre, home of the Royal Shakespeare Company, reopened in 2010 after a £112.8 million renovation. Holy Trinity Church holds Shakespeare's grave, marked by a personal curse he wrote himself. The inscription on his grave slab, in his own words, reads, "Good friend, for Jesus' sake forbear to dig the dust enclosed here. Blessed be the man that spares these stones, and cursed be he that moves my bones." The curse has apparently worked, because no one has ever dared exhume him in 4 centuries. Shakespeare weaponized his own epitaph, and it's still functioning. Anne Hathaway's cottage, the thatched farmhouse where Shakespeare courted his wife, sits a 20-minute walk outside town. The King Edward VI School, where Shakespeare actually studied, is still a functioning school today. Children sit in the same building, learning similar grammar 400 years later, which is one of the wildest continuities in British education. When Maggie O'Farrell's novel Hamlet was adapted into a 2026 film, visitor numbers jumped 15 to 20% in a single season. One novel from 2020 about Shakespeare's son gets adapted 6 years later, and the town immediately feels it at the ticket counters. That's the scale of literary tourism we're dealing with. The trick of Stratford is that somehow, despite the numbers, it still reads as a genuine Warwickshire market town. No skyscrapers, no shopping malls, no chain restaurants pushing out the Tudor timber. One travel writer put it bluntly when she wrote that despite the crowds, Stratford still feels like a tiny English town, which, given the scale of the tourism, is either a quiet miracle or a conservation effort so aggressive it should probably have its own national medal. Now we're at number 1. A small city with 2 UNESCO listings, the only natural hot springs in the entire United Kingdom, and the reason most of Bridgerton looks the way it does. And number 1, Bath, Somerset, England. Population 94,080. Annual visitors over 6 million. Bath is the largest destination on this list, and technically a city rather than a town or village. Here's why it still earns the top spot. Bath is the only UK destination with UNESCO World Heritage status twice over, once in 1987 on its own, and again in 2021 as part of the Great Spa Towns of Europe network. Very few cities anywhere in the world can say that. Romans founded it in roughly 60 AD, calling the place Aquae Sulis, the waters of Sulis. They built the entire settlement around the only natural hot springs in Britain, 3 sources pushing out 1.17 million litres of 46-degree water every single day. Here's the detail that breaks most people's brains. The water falling from those taps today originally landed as rain on the Mendip Hills roughly 10,000 years ago, seeped underground, got heated by geothermal activity 2 kilometres below the surface, and has only just resurfaced that now. Bathers in Bath are literally swimming in Bronze Age precipitation. The Roman Baths complex attracts over 1 million visitors a year on its own, making it the second most visited paid attraction outside London, behind only Stonehenge. When Roman pilgrims threw coins and curse tablets into the sacred spring, they apparently meant business. Archaeologists have recovered over 12,000 Roman coins, along with personal curses scratched onto lead sheets. One genuine surviving example, translated from Latin, reads, quote, "Whoever stole my bathing tunic, I curse him and his family." That is the oldest recorded British complaint, and it's aimed at a bathhouse thief. Very little has changed. The Georgian era reinvented Bath as England's most fashionable spa city. John Wood the Younger's Royal Crescent, built between 1767 and 1775, is a single curved block of 30 Georgian townhouses carved in uniform Bath stone, honey-coloured limestone that glows amber at sunset. Pulteney Bridge, designed by Robert Adam in 1774, is one of only 4 bridges in the world with shops built continuously along both sides. Jane Austen lived here from 1801 to 1806 and set 2 of her novels, Northanger Abbey and Persuasion, in the city. Every September, the Jane Austen Festival holds the Guinness World Record for the largest gathering of people dressed in Regency costume. Over 900 participants at once parading through the streets in bonnets and tailcoats. Bath Abbey is where King Edgar was crowned the first King of England in 973, which predates most European nation-states by a comfortable several centuries. In December of 2020, Netflix's Bridgerton turned the entire city into a Regency London stand-in. The Royal Crescent became the Featherington family home. The Holborn Museum transformed into Lady Danbury's mansion. Abbey Green served as Madame Delacroix's dress shop. When the 4th season dropped in early 2026, Bath saw a visitor spike that local tourism officials are still quietly celebrating behind closed doors, reportedly comparing it to Christmas coming twice. Therme Bath Spa is the only place in the United Kingdom where visitors can actually bathe in natural thermal water. Picture the rooftop pool at dusk, steam rising off warm water, Georgian rooftops glowing copper in the fading light. The city arranging itself below you like it was designed specifically for that view. Because, in fairness, most of it was. The water temperature sits at a constant 33.5 degrees Celsius, which matters less once you realise you're soaking in the same spring the Romans considered sacred 2,000 years ago. Bath proves the central argument of this entire list. A small city of 94,000 people can quietly hold 2 UNESCO listings, 2,000 years of continuous history, the only thermal springs in Britain, and 6 million visitors a year, while most Brits still think of it as that one place with the old baths. Which it is, technically. But it is also one of the most architecturally layered destinations anywhere in Europe, soaked in everything from Iron Age myth to prime-time streaming drama. If this video helped you discover a place you had never heard of, Hit like and subscribe, not because YouTube demands it, but because the algorithm runs on attention. See you in the next video.